As you can see, we're starting things off just a little bit different this morning. Don't have the music playing. It has been 2 days of some technical issues. And so I'm hoping that the that the audio is really working as I record this message for you today. And I hope you're having a good day. Here in Sherman, this is Thursday, the 21st of September. Yesterday we had some pretty good rains the last couple of days, and we're supposed to get some today. And we hope you're faring well wherever you are today. We are in Psalm 76 as we now begin again our journey through the Psalms. Having taken a break for a few weeks, we went through 75, and that's half of the Psalms, and now we have the second half. And it's taken us roughly a year and a half to go through the first half of the Psalms, so I guess it'll take that long to finish them out. Maybe longer, especially when we get to Psalm 119. But we're looking today at Psalm 76, and as usual, I like to start with a question. And the question today is, do you or do you not feel like God is fighting for you? That's kind of what this psalm is all about. God fighting for you. Or do you feel sometimes like God is actually against you? Or at the least maybe not even with you? Well, this psalm speaks to the ever-present God and his care about his people that he's always had, and that means his care about you. That God is fighting for you. You know who he's fighting? He's fighting Satan for you. And the strongest fight, the most obvious fight that he has put up was when he sent his son to die for you, to fight against Satan's last weapon, you might say, the weapon of death itself. And that was overcome. Victory was had when Jesus came out of that tomb. So yes, God is fighting for you. And so let's kind of work our way through this psalm, and we'll do what we usually do. We divide it into several parts before we read it. I might point out first that in the superscript it says this is not a psalm of David, it's a psalm of Asaph. Remember, it says to the choir master with instrumental music, a psalm of Asaph, a song. That's how the superscription reads in my Bible. And so we know who Asaph was, right? I'd call him the choir director. He was the lead singer, you might say, or composer, or both, or arranger for the temple. And apparently this is one that he wrote, and not David, And Asaph, being the lead singer, musician, he obviously would have put it to music. And it says here it was with the accompanying stringed instruments. So as I look at this psalm, I divide it basically into three sections, though you could, I think, go four. But the first section is simply the first three verses. And those verses describe the God, our God of renown. You know, renown means he's known. That he's out there, that you can't miss him, and that he's known by several people, a lot of people, known in several places. And so that's our God. The next three verses, 4, 5, and 6, kind of talk about the resplendent God, and that's not really a word that we use a whole lot, but it means a God who shows off, if you please, a God who does things so you know that he's there, that God. And then the rest of the psalm can be divided really into just one section, and it depends on how you want to go. You could just call it the awesome God. So we have the God of renown, the God who is resplendent, and the God who is awesome. And that makes a nice three-part sermon, if you please. Or you can also look at that last section and maybe divide it into two. The first three verses talking about judgment coming from God. Judgment's not always a good word when it comes from God. So judgment coming from God, and then the omniscience of God in the last three verses. And that would be another way to look at it. But whether you look at it with three divisions or four divisions, it's all about God, is it not? So let's take a moment to read this composition from Asaph that's recorded for us in the 76th Psalm. Again, reading from my English Standard Version of Scripture, Psalm 76. To the choir master, with stringed instruments, a psalm of Asaph, a song. In Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. His abode has been established in Salem. His dwelling place is Zion. There he broke the flashing arrows, the shield, the sword, and the weapons of war. Glorious are you, and more majestic than the mountains of prey. The stout-hearted were stripped of their spoil. They sank into the sleep. All men of war were unable to use their hands. At your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both horse and rider lay stunned. But you are to be feared. Who can stand before you when once your anger is roused? From the heavens you uttered judgment. The earth feared and was still when God arose to establish judgment, to save all the humble of the earth. Surely the wrath of man shall praise you. The remnant of wrath you will put on like a belt. Make your vows to the Lord your God and keep them. Let all around him bring gifts to him who is to be feared, who cuts off the spirit of princes, who is to be feared by the kings of the earth. So much is said about God in these 12 short verses, and they all really speak to answering our question of the day. Do you ever feel like God is fighting for you, or do you feel like he's not fighting for you, or do you feel like he's not even with you? And unfortunately, we probably make that assessment according to how good or bad things are going in our lives, and maybe we say, well, if they're going bad, God must not be fighting with me or for me, and that's simply not the case. God either fights for us and with us, or he doesn't. No matter how the times are in our life, whether they're good or bad, excuse me, God fights for us, and God fights with us. So this psalm starts out with, in essence, saying God is known where he needs to be known. And it uses expressions that all point to Jerusalem. He uses first that in Judah God is known. Well, of course, Judah was a tribe, right? One of the tribes of Israel, and it was also the name for the southern kingdom. That was Judah, right? The northern kingdom was Israel, you might remember, when the north and the south split. So there's Judah, and by the way, Jesus was of the tribe of Judah. So in Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel, so now we've got Judah and Israel taken care of. And now his abode has been established in Salem. Salem is one of the words that was used for Jerusalem early on. And so maybe he's saying here that even in the city that he began to call his, and it was called the city of David, Jerusalem, even before that, God was known. And then it says his dwelling place is Zion, which is another name for Jerusalem, and maybe in particular what was known as the Temple Mount, or where the temple was. And so you couldn't, in essence, go anywhere in Jerusalem without knowing God. Now the question is all of that a metaphor for everywhere? Everywhere God is known. You know, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is believed in everywhere, but God is known. And maybe it started right there in Jerusalem. And maybe even this is a brief uh, prophecy of the coming of Jesus, who was of the tribe of Judah, and then spent many days of his ministry in Jerusalem. And maybe all of that is somehow working together. Jesus said, if you knew me, you knew the Father. So he is a God of renown, and now he's a God who is glorious, resplendent. And it's interesting how he points out that glory. He compares it, first of all, to the mountaintop full of prey. Well, prey, that's the food for bigger animals, right? And so he's saying to you and me that I've got all of this. That I've got all this, and maybe he's even talking about he's so big he can show protection to those who would be prey. Later in this psalm, he does talk about the humble saving the humble, and that kind of thing was going on. Yes, even in Israel, where those who were poor were being taken advantage of by those who were richer, better off, and so those who were richer were getting richer at the expense of the poor. Or you could talk about the big powerful kings that are mentioned in the Old Testament that were able to just more or less run over the smaller, weaker countries. And he's saying, God has got this. God has even got this. And he says, for these other folks who think they're so powerful, you know nothing compared to the glory and splendor and power of God. Nothing. Matter of fact, compared to him, you're even unable to use, my version says, use your hands. And of course, the hands were the things that were used, of course, as to use the weapons of war. But then he says this. What an interesting and yet powerful statement about God. He says, at your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both rider and horse are stunned. Well, I don't know about you, but my mind kind of goes a couple of ways here. Number one, I think of a stun gun. A stun gun, not as powerful as a pistol or a rifle, who could kill, but it can do enough to bring a person down. And here it says that God's rebuke, the words from God's mouth, can bring down the rider and the horse. Now that's a powerful God. My version does use the word rebuke, and when I hear the word rebuke, I can't but think of when Jesus and those disciples were in that boat, that storm. And depending on which episode you're reading and from what version you're reading from, it says Jesus rebuked two things. He rebuked the storm and said, "Peace, be still." So he's saying that with an attitude of rebuke. So that's a strong dismissal, if you please, of the storm. Then we'll also read that then he rebuked his disciples for their little faith. And that's a strong rebuke too. You see here what the words of God can do. Genesis 1, we can start reading there, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. Several times in Scripture we're told of how God spoke the creation into existence. And God will say, whatever I speak, whatever I say, I'm going to follow through. I'm going to carry out. At his rebuke, horses and riders were brought down. Then the next section in this passage will speak to the judgment that God brings, and really the judgment that He brings in behalf of the humble. Maybe these are marginalized people. Maybe these are ones who are just barely scraping along. Maybe it's the ones that get pushed aside in society. But in saving them, He says, you can't stand before me no matter who you think you are. No matter who you think you are. And you're really not to be feared. Really? Are you? But you can fear God when once His anger has been roused. You know, we talk about fearing God, and some people will say, you know, I'm not afraid of God. And I think we're misunderstanding the idea of fear here, but there are some things we need to be afraid of, and maybe there's some things about God we need to be afraid of. But our typical day in and day out fear of God is a very humble awe and respect for God. But I just remember what Rahab the harlot said there in Jericho when those men came to her, and she, in essence, she said, we've heard what your God did, and she speaks of like crossing the Red Sea and things of that, and she indeed feared God. She feared what God was going to be able to do to Jericho, and she asked for these men to remember her, that she's the one that helped them. Maybe there's a time to be afraid. And God will bring judgment, and He will save the humble. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. You know, showing mercy is not considered in our society maybe a sign of strength, but Jesus says it is. And then He says some interesting things about wrath. First He says in verse 10, surely the wrath of man shall praise you. That's a nice line in the song there, Asaph. But what he's saying there, that even in what men do in anger and in wrath, in essence, will bring praise to God because it's so little. It's so little. And He says then, the remnant of wrath He will put on, my version says, like a belt. In other words, I'm going to gather that remnant to me. They're going to be with me. They're going to be around me. They're going to surround me. You know, the idea of remnant has been presented to us over and over in Scripture, to the point that it was a remnant, and it's called that in Scripture, right? A remnant of God's people left Babylon to once again inhabit their promised land. But it was a remnant. It was just a part of the original. Just a part. My wife and my mother-in-law do a lot of things, sewing, etc., and they always have this basket of what they call remnants, pieces, that by themselves are really not any good, but they can be used in other projects to bring about beauty, to bring about completion, to bring about fulfillment. And God says, I gather my remnant around me like I wear a belt. Secure in God. And then he adds this thing about making vows. Now, God has never commanded anybody to make a vow, although when you became a Christian, you in essence made a vow of continual faithfulness to God no matter what. And maybe we don't always understand that. That it wasn't a matter of just getting wet in baptism, but it was a matter of commitment to God, saying, okay, God, I'm yours and you're mine, and it's going to be us together for the rest of my life. You can call that a vow if you want to. But typically a vow was, God, if you do this, then I will do that. And maybe we've all been caught in that. Maybe life had turned so sour for us and we couldn't see any way out, that our final prayer to God was, God, if you'll take care of this situation, then I will never miss church service again. Then I will speak to my neighbors about Jesus. Then I will take care of the needs of the poor. And maybe whatever situation that was taken care of, and maybe even we initially began to keep what we said until it trails off. Or maybe we never started. Well, this explains how God feels about vows. If you're going to make a vow to God, you keep it. And I'm reminded of Jephthah in the book of Judges, who God had brought him forward as a judge to go take care of the enemy. And Jephthah says, okay, if you make me victorious over the enemy when I get back home, I will sacrifice to you the first thing that comes out of my house. And I'm thinking that Jephthah probably thought that his favorite dog might run out, or his chicken, or a cat. But no, it was his daughter that came out of the house first. And Jephthah tells how remorseful he was at that, but he says, I've opened my mouth to God and can't go back. Sometimes vows can be rash, not thought out. Maybe in a moment of an emergency or something like that. Maybe we've prayed for our children who are so sick. God, if you'll just heal this child, I'll dedicate him to you. You know, Hannah did that. It wasn't because her child was sick, it's because she didn't have one. And she said, God, if you'll give me a child, I'll dedicate him to you in the temple. And she did. So those vows are important to God. They may be more important to him than they are to us if we give them without thought. So there's the vow thing. It's kind of interesting that stuck in here. But then he says everybody around ought to bring gifts to this God. Everybody should do that. And he says, I am to be feared. So don't take that away. I am to be feared. And speaking of fearing, okay, I cut off the spirit of the princess. And speaking of the kings of the earth, who else can be feared? Let's read those last two verses together. Make your vows to the Lord your God and perform them. Let all around him bring gifts. To him who is feared, to be feared, who cuts off the spirit of princes, who is to be feared by the kings of the earth. You don't need to fear the kings of the earth. You need to fear the one that the kings of the earth fear. And that's God. So we see in a psalm that yes, indeed, our God, who is a God of renown, our God who is a resplendent personality, we see our God who is awesome, that he is a God who fights with us and for us. He does it his way. And that could be the issue, that we think, well, if a God's going to fight for us, he's going to do this. He's going to move all of our troubles out of our lives. He never said he'd do that. But on the lines of battle, he's right there with us and fighting for us and fighting with us, giving us strength, giving us perseverance, giving us dedication, giving us courage to continue to walk through life faithful to him. Reminds me of an old song we used to sing in the youth group. I don't know if they still sing them among young people or not. It goes, what a mighty God we serve. What a mighty God we serve. What a mighty God we serve. Angels bow before him. Heaven and earth adore him. What a mighty God we serve. Short song. Very powerful. Just remember that your God is fighting for you. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord lift his countenance upon you. And may the Lord give you peace.